And hello to the Gay Roll podcast. This is episode 2 of my podcast ever. And today's guest is, I'm very grateful for him to agree to come onto the show. It's second ever, so there's still a lot to learn about editing and going through the process of interviewing. But I'm really happy that he came on. He's a person that I knew from high school, and his name is Kayden here, and I will bring him onto the screen. All right, Kayden, they can see you now. This is my friend Kayden from Long Beach Polytechnic High School. Kayden, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. Happy that I could join you for this podcast adventure you have embarked on.
Yes. Again, I think I stated earlier, I'm just, just really happy. Or when I first was coming up with the podcast, I shared with you earlier that, I had a couple people in mind specifically that I needed to interview, and you were definitely on the top 5. I think that you had just a lot to share, and just a cool person in general from what I remember from my experiences in high school. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, happy to be there.
Yeah, so Kayden, I knew him, like I said, from high school. We were both in the PACE program there. Let's see. So yeah, most of my experiences were from just kind of classmates in class. I knew that I remember I knew we took Miss Araya in freshman year.
I was trying to remember which class we met, and yeah, I think it was Mr. Raya's class, because I think I have a specific memory. For April 1st, we had a test. And her like joke present to us was it got to be a group test, so whoever we were sitting next to was our test partner.
Right.
And I remember I think we were taking the test together, and Mr. Rye's class was not my strongest class. You definitely had it more on it than I was. Really? So I remember feeling a little bit bad because I was like, oh, I'm definitely dragging down his grade.
Oh, wow. I honestly, I really don't remember that particular thing, but if I were to put myself back in past Gabriel's self, no, like I would have been like, Kayden, like I need your help, and I'm sure that I'm sure we did okay at that test.
We passed, so
That is true. We got it. We got through it. But yeah, I remember, yeah, her class was really fun. As for science classes, she was, I think, really cool as a teacher.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, she was a fun teacher. It was definitely. I think it was my definitely one of the shocker introduction classes coming from the middle school I'd gone to like the PACE program. I was definitely like, oh, okay, this is gonna be challenging. All right.
I see. Yeah. And then were you? I'm thinking Mr. Arfwenson. Is that a teacher we had together?
Yeah, Arfie was 11th grade English.
What did you think about Mr. Arfwenson?
I liked him. I appreciated his sense of humor.
Brevity and clarity.
So yeah, I brevity and clarity, which is still extremely important to my writing. So
yeah, definitely. I even the other people that I still talk to from that class, they still remember that kind of statement in their writing. They still try to implement it. So he had a definite positive impact in the students that he came across. And
yes,
then
for sure.
And then was there? I'm thinking also English sophomore year we had. I forgot her name, but
that was Miss Lawrence.
Miss Lawrence. Yes, I think so.
Often had a. I think her hair was pink and blue for most of our black and pink and blue for most of our year.
Yes, second floor of one of the buildings. I remember.
Yeah.
In the same one as calculus, was it?
Yeah, it was right next door to calculus, right?
Okay. Yeah, no, that was fun. That was a fun class. Like, I love the all the personalities of the PACE teachers. I think they were all very charismatic and inspiring. Yeah. So yeah, so we met in high school. Another thing that you did in high school was Jrotc. I never really actually. Oh, I'm sorry. I never really actually knew what the acronym stood for. Do you remember what it stood for?
Yeah. So it's Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps.
How did you? What were the origins of that journey for you?
So I knew that I wanted to do it coming into high school because I'd gone like toured poly like their open house. I think when I was in middle school or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And ROTC always did like a thing for open house. They had like a performance, or but then they were also just like wandering around to make sure people didn't get lost. So I thought I knew I wanted to do it partially because like my family had like history of like doing military stuff. But also because it got me out of gym class, and this sounded more entertaining than like doing that beeper timed running thing that I watched all of gym class do for 4 years.
Right. That is super interesting. Whenever I saw the JROTC though, whenever I was passing by, it seemed like their training was a lot more intense than the PE ones.
No. If 14-year-old me's idea was to like take the less physically intense route, I think I screwed up on that. Because I definitely ended up doing a lot more push-ups than I ever saw the PE class doing.
I think so. I think every morning I would see a group of them like outside, like, and they were just going at it. And I was just like, wow, like that's dedication. So yeah, how was you did that for all 4 years? Was it?
Yeah, I did that for all 4 years. That was my like main extracurricular activity, I guess. And that was where probably I made most of my friends. I definitely had like friends from PACE, but I was probably spent more time with ROTC, just because it was kind of a big time commitment. But it was fun because it definitely gave me a lot of opportunities for like leadership development, and I was a pretty shy kid coming into high school, and so it sort of forced me to like speak up for myself and sort of like navigate different power dynamics and stuff. So
that's really cool. I also came into high school very like shy and kind of quiet, and I think that an experience like that would definitely kind of help you kind of get your own voice kind of thing, and a little bit more solid footing under you. Yeah, would you recommend that experience to other people coming into high school?
I don't know. I think I mean, as with everything, it depends on like a lot of like who you are as a person and like what you want out of things. Because like I definitely benefited from it, but it also definitely caused me a lot of anxiety at the same time. So I think like in hindsight overall, I'm definitely like glad I did it. But there were definitely a lot of times in the moment where I was like, I'm already really stressed because of all the like homework and class stuff that we're doing, and I'm stressed because like I have all of this like ROTC stuff that I have to do. So mixed bag. I'd say try it, but if it's after the first year, if it's not for you, like don't be upset if you peace out.
I see. Okay. Yeah, no, definitely. Pace, on top of the whole pace thing as well, like you mentioned, like pace was not. What did you think about pace? I didn't think pace was easy. I think it was challenging.
Yeah, so I don't think that anything that I did in college in terms of both the subject, like the complexity of the subject matter in combination with just like the sheer workload, I think that was harder in pace than I found any of like the college work that I did. Um, and I don't know if that was just like developmentally of like you're in a different place when you're like taking classes when you're 15 compared to when you're like 20.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I remember kind of being a little bit grateful for it because like when I got to college, it didn't feel, at least to me with the classes that I was taking, like it got harder. It was sort of like pace had been up here, and then college was like it was like a relief almost.
No, yeah, I think definitely like that's also like how I think felt as well, like as going in as like a, at least definitely for my first 2 years in college. Um, the pace, yeah, they really set they really make you work for the all 4 years of that you
Yeah,
spend there. Um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, for me, like I
Just
liked. Mhm.
the sheer just the sheer just like quantity of work, I think, was what did, like, if it had been spread out more, I think it wouldn't have been as bad. But like just when you had like all of these English readings on top of like history smos on top of like learning another language, all with homework due the next day, that was just like a little bit much.
Yeah, agreed, agreed. I think, yeah, all the pace people kind of had very similar sentiments. I feel. I think it was very common, the whole idea that people were just when pace kids would complain. I think people around campus were just like, "Well, you signed up for it," and then I'm just like, I mean, I guess.
I guess my mom signed me up for it. That's more what happened, but
True, that's actually true. But yeah, so pace happened. So okay, so we went through high school pace. Tell me how you went to decide on your college, and were you always um, going, like, was it always from the start like psychology as your thing?
um, it was at least pretty close. I for a while thought that I wanted to be like a special education teacher. I At Poly, I spent a lot of um, time like hanging out in one of the special education classrooms that was like right next to ROTC's classroom.
Mm.
Um, I still talk with some of the students that I met there, but realized before applying to college, but I realized that I didn't actually want to deal with all the red tape of like teaching in like public school systems. So I sort of shifted from special ed to thinking that I wanted to do like direct therapy with autistic people, and so that was what I ended up applying to college to do. Was I applied to schools that had undergrad degrees in applied behavior analysis, of which there aren't that many in the country. So that
Okay.
was like easy and narrowed. It was kind of nice because everybody, I felt like a lot of PACE people that I knew were like stressing about like Harvard or Berkeley or like impressive name schools, and I was like, I didn't even apply to those because they don't have what I want to study. Like, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
um, so that was kind of nice. I didn't really have to do some of the worrying that I feel like some of my classmates were doing. Um,
Yeah.
but so I went, yeah. So I and then I ended up going to Binghamton University, which is like a state school in New York, not in New York City, like rural small town New York.
Okay.
Um,
So was that like, you said there was only a couple schools. Was New York like when you looked up that school, was there anything in particular about that school that really caught your interest?
Um, Part of it was I have my dad's side of the family is like on the East Coast, like New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York area. He's the strange sibling that fled across the country.
Right.
So it definitely like some of the appeal was definitely like that I'd get to live like by or like within driving distance of like some aunts and uncles and cousins that I hadn't gotten to spend as much time with. Another big factor was that it snows in New York, and I really like snow, so I was very excited to move to a city that is like cloudy 200 plus days of the year and gets like several feet of snow every year.
Wow, that is that is cool. You how long did you stay at New York?
I lived in Binghamton for 5 years, so I graduated undergrad after the four, and then I stayed there for a year after graduating to work and get some research experience while I was applying for grad school.
Did your opinion of the snow stay the same for all 5 years?
Pretty much. It became a little bit more tepid once I got a car and had to like shovel my car out of the snow at like 6 in the morning to go to work.
Right.
Um, but even then, it wasn't like that terrible. Like once it gets to the point where like you're really annoyed at shoveling school or whatever, it's probably been canceled.
I see.
Overall, still very net positive opinion.
Cool. So, how did you always live like in California for like as a kid, like growing up all the way to high school?
Yeah, I always lived in Long Beach. I am sitting in the house that I like grew up in. So,
How was the transition from like there to New York?
um, honestly, it was pretty good. I was kind of looking forward to like having a little bit more space, and like kind of uh, I don't know, figuring out how to be like an independent person and like I don't know, find yourself or whatever. Um,
I love that.
um, yeah, but no, I did pretty well with it. I had a lot of anxiety in high school that a lot of it was related to like just not having a whole lot of control over my life. Some of it because like, you have to be in school X many hours a day, and then like just living with other people sort of you inevitably only have so much control over your life, and I also couldn't drive at that point, so moving to be on my own, going to college was sort of like going to a space where I had pretty complete say over like how I did things, so that was like very like anxiety relieving for me.
Definitely. I think that college experience to kind of like you said find yourself and and be that independent, and try to be like form that independent self and move on with the world kind of thing. um
Yeah.
cool. How was your so you said that it did seem like you did start out already knowing like psychology was going to be your thing. Throughout the process of going through undergrad, like was it um like was there any like difficulty of like ever thinking about changing majors, or was it just like you just kind of built on each other and then you're just like, yeah, like I know like I'm gonna finish like with psychology?
um it was pretty much building on each other. I never like thought about changing majors. I always knew I sort of changed like within psychology where I was focusing. But I never thought about like switching to a different like department,
Okay.
um, which was sort of an even split among like the friends that I made. There were a few of us that came in was like we're in this department, and like that was like very clearly where we stayed. And then I have some friends who like definitely like switched majors like 3 to 5 times, which was always sort of like interesting to like watch, like as someone who was like very clear on like kind of where they were going, of just like the changes of that they were like, I don't know, going through in terms of like where they saw themselves, and like just that development was sort of interesting to watch, but also not exactly be able to identify with, because I was like, I don't, what else would I do? I have no idea.
I see. Cool. Yeah, no, it's really nice when you're able to stumble upon something that like you really like know like this is for me, and you're able to kind of like line everything up to that. It does make life a little bit, as chaotic life is already, like to have something a little bit, simple like that, and it's nice. It's nice.
It it definitely is, and I think like it definitely impacts when I'm like talking to people who are, or like high schoolers who are sort of like thinking about college, and especially like the sort of like, oh, do you want to start at like a community college and then transfer? Do you want to like start straight at a 4 year? And like definitely the advice I give is very different if like someone has like a pretty firm idea of, oh, I want to do biology or computer science, versus someone who's like, I don't really know what I want to do. I don't really have any ideas. Just because with college being so expensive, like don't spend money getting a degree if you're like really not sure that it's going to help you. Like maybe spend less money and stay local and sort of find out what you're passionate about first, if that's an option for you.
Definitely. I think that's definitely very logical. you know, um, Approach to the whole college thing. Um, money, I mean, it is very expensive. So if you could save some money and also like just give yourself a little bit more time to think about what you want, that'd be good.
Yeah, definitely.
So, hmm. So when you were finishing up your degree, um, did you know like right away like you wanted to go to graduate school? Like that was just like the next step for you.
Yeah. So I had shifted a little bit, while I was in college. Like I had said that I had been looking at schools that did degrees in applied behavior analysis, and I realized, while doing that sort of specialization in my psychology degree, that um, that wasn't the focus I wanted to take. I was more interested in um, research of psychology than like practical application. Um, so I knew that I would have to go to grad school, but the exact like kind of grad school sort of like changed as I realized I no longer wanted to do ABA, and I was and looking more into like more strict research. Um, so yeah, I did essentially know that grad school was the next step, um, which was very like um, advantageous, um, for me, just because like I sort of was looking into like how does grad school work and how do you apply to it pretty early on, and so I was sort of investigating that path. Um, but I definitely know a lot of people who sort of like didn't know much about grad school until like they had had graduated, or it had been, or it was getting to be like application time, but it was still really confusing. So I think, um, that was like another point where just like sort of being on a pretty similar straight road through undergrad sort of was helpful for me.
Cool. Um, so let's see. So you settled with. So you did find the graduate program that you did finally settle on.
Mm.
Oh wait, actually before that, you mentioned ABA, right? So ABA was more of it, to my understanding. ABA was, like you said, the more practical application of that research. Uh,
So ABA um, is a therapy used for autistic and generally it involves like you working with children or adults like in a school setting or at home. So sort of very like practical application. And for various reasons, I decided that wasn't for me.
mm-hmm.
And I'm more interested in doing like um, research. So um, a lot of that like day to day looks like reading lots of papers and designing experiments and analyzing data and writing up what I find.
Okay. Were you always like that day to day, like all the things you mentioned? Like, did you always have like an affinity towards those topics or activities?
Yeah, I think so. I was always like the kid to kind of like go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole and start clicking on all the sources in Wikipedia and then like find yourself like 20 pages deep in like a very narrow topic. So like that kind of lends itself to research very well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my main like hesitation when I was deciding to go into research was I was like, oh, I'm not really good at like computer coding. I'd taken like AP Comp Sci in senior year, and I actually like transferred out of it at the second semester because I think grade wise I was going to get like a D in the class, but the teacher didn't actually submit grades, so I ended up with an A in the class by default. um,
Nice.
yeah, um,
Was
but
coding?
now
Did coding play or was as big as a part as you thought it would be?
it definitely is. But it's turned out that I'm actually not bad at it. I just think either the format that I was being taught in or just the time that I was learning it the first time around wasn't like the right time. But now that like I have like immediate relevance for what I'm learning or like motivation to learn it, I guess is like I have this data and I need to analyze it. I need to figure out how to do that. Like it's much easier for me to learn it this time around.
Cool. Well, I'm happy that you were able to turn that around. um. So yeah, that's cool. You like the research part. Doing, and the research takes a long time. It.
Yeah. Science is really slow. And I like work. I mean, like I think we're gonna talk about this later, but like the paper that I published, I started like do it like I started doing the research or like the background like reading for that in like 2015, 2016. I finished collecting all the data uh, in 2017, and it only just got published at the end of 2020. Um, so like it takes a long time.
Definitely. What was 2016? Was that where were you at in the education like process? There were you still were you in grad school? No, undergrad.
No, I was an undergrad. I was 2016. I was sophomore, junior, depending on time of year.
Okay, so you were collecting data. Even like, did you like think that far ahead? You think, or was it just a?
Um, yeah, I was. So I started doing research. Part of the reason that I ended up going to the college I went to was they were starting this like freshman research immersion program. So like it was like a program that you kind of got like it was randomly selected for when you were applying to the school, and it was like if you're in this program, you can start working in a research lab your first semester in college, which is like uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, oh, that seems like a cool, nifty little program. So that sort of like pushed me to go towards Binghamton versus other options. Um, but that also sort of, helped me be aware of sort of like, oh, research is kind of important if you want to go to grad school in psychology. So I just sort of kept working in research labs and then learned that, okay, the like output of doing research and collecting data is generally like academic papers in this field. So sort of learned just sort of like how the like chain of production in this like field worked.
Yeah. So you got like a head start. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. That these are from all I'm hearing, that these are all very nice like dominoes to have, like that you kind of stacked up for yourself, to get you in the right
Yeah.
direction.
I think kind of the image of like the dominoes like stacking up definitely is like a pretty appropriate one.
Cool. So so you went from Binghamton University. I said that wrong. New
Hmm.
York. To University of Virginia.
Yeah.
So how is that? So you moved to Virginia? Was it?
Hmm. Yeah, I moved to Virginia summer of 2019.
Okay. And is that still where you reside for when you're over there?
Yeah. I pretty much live in Virginia.
How is Virginia?
Um, it's okay. I really did like living in Binghamton, in New York. So I definitely do miss there. It doesn't snow very much in Virginia. Um, there are a lot more Confederate flags.
Mm.
Um, Not that we didn't have any in rural New York, but there's just a little more.
Mm.
Um, it's my first time like living in the South, so that's kind of been interesting. I'm not really a religious person, and Binghamton was a pretty not huge religious presence university, but definitely UVA has like a pretty like a lot of like student like religious groups that are pretty like prominent. So it's just
Mm.
sort of been interesting to see sort of the differences living in different places.
That is, I would think that would be very interesting. Kind of to observe. Um, if you had a choice, after your grad program, where would you go? Do you think?
Um, like I said, I did like living in New York. I think I'd like to try living in some other places. I am hoping to stay like in the academic field, so like work at a university like once I'm finished with school, like teaching and doing research. Um, and for like the job market, you don't necessarily have a whole lot of say in like where you live. It's kind of like, universities in these states are hiring this year, and you go where you get hired. Um, so yeah, I feel like I try to keep like a pretty open mind in terms of like where I could end up living, just knowing that.
I see. Okay. Okay. What about if we talk about the lab that you are currently working at?
Hmm. Yeah, so I at University of Virginia, I'm in the psychology department, and I work in the Jrotc lab, and which is named for like the last name of my advisor. Uh, some labs like have sort of like descriptive names of like, oh, like infant vision development lab, but some labs are like just named after sort of like the person who runs it. Um, and so we study sort of broadly issues related to autistic people. We study autistic communication and interaction and perceptions of autistic people, and sort of a range of questions that don't always neatly fall in one category. Because the research that we try to do is sort of like research priorities that are informed by autistic people. So it's not necessarily just like, oh, we work in this like one silo. We might sort of have like a couple of different areas of work happening.
Okay. Yeah. I was reading the newsletter that you had recently shared that the University of Virginia Child Development Labs put out, and going back to the name of the lab, there was 4 labs that they had listed, and they had the early development lab, the baby lab, and the early social development lab. And then I saw this 4th one, the Jrotc lab, and I was like, that's really interesting. I was like, wait, is that like a word that I just don't know? And then I looked at the advisors that you were talking about, and I saw there was a Dr. Jrotc. And I was just like, oh, okay, he just named it after himself. But do you know like why?
Yeah, it used.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it used to have a descriptive name. I think it was the Child Language Lab, because he used to study something different. He studied more about like language development and what children thought about like fairness and testimony. And then he sort of did like a pivot into autism research. So I think to kind of just like link his old work and his new work and, maybe protect against any potential future pivots, he was just like, no, we're just going with my name. It's just all under what I am doing versus like this topic, since my topic switched.
All right. What do you think about him, your advisor, Dr. Jrotc?
He's Vikram is great. I love him. When I was figuring out where to go to grad school, I applied a bunch of places. I applied when I was in college the first time. Got in one place, but it wasn't going to work out for a couple of reasons, so I said no, and then I like worked for another year and reapplied. And I got into a couple of places this time. So when I was sort of like deciding where to go, the person that I would be working with, the advisor, was like really important, because it's less so much that you are applying to like a school versus you're like applying to like a specific person who happens to be at a school. And so Vikram was very caring and like seemed very like interested in like what I wanted out of grad school and like helping my development, versus like seeing me as just sort of like labor to do what he was interested in. And that's definitely panned out in terms of like he's very engaged in like my development, and the other 2 grad students that are also in his lab are individual development, and then also like the development of like the undergrad research assistants. So yeah, I really enjoy working with him.
All right, very nice. And then and a couple of questions that did pop up on the newsletter that it looked like the Jrotc lab was researching, or is researching. One of them was studying parents and children's understanding of emotions. Is that?
Yeah, so that's one of the other grad students in my lab's projects, and so he's looking at sort of like emotion recognition and threshold detection. So like how much emotion on there feels like, that's happy, or that's sad, and seeing if that is different in mothers of autistic children compared to mothers of non-autistic children. Just because some research suggests that autistic people show more muted emotion, facial expressions of emotion, or show facial expressions of emotion differently. And so seeing if having this experience of parenting an autistic child might change your sort of like threshold for detecting a facial sort of expression of an emotion.
Very. Yeah, I thought when I was reading that part, yeah, it was definitely interesting. How, just like how hard it is, I guess, for like to match that, like the parents and the kids, like they do spend a lot of time together, and to have like to not have that, to not be on the same page on something like that could definitely be hard.
And it's um, interesting because that's sort of not being on the same page. I guess like analogy sort of extends to like a lot of autism research, but like so my soapbox that like relates to a lot of the work that I do is historically a lot of autism research has sort of been from the perspective of like there's difficulties in social interaction or communication or people not being on the same page because autistic people are bad at communicating or bad at interacting or like sort of a very like the deficit is like clearly in this one person, but like interaction is always like reciprocal and there's always like if there's one person it's not an interaction. So sort of changing the sort of perspective or the focus of research to be more looking at both of the interactants. So instead of just having research that says, oh, autistic people are bad at reading facial expressions, if you sort of change the focus or how you ask the question, you also find that, oh, non-autistic people are bad at reading autistic people's facial expressions and emotions as well. It's not like just a one-sided thing. It's sort of if you flip and look at like the other side of this metaphorical coin, it's not so much a like, oh, autism makes you bad at something. It's a more like people interacting with other people who have different experiences and ways of perceiving things have challenges understanding each other.
Definitely. I think what you're hitting on is like it's like all in the like the initial thing is like all in the perspective of like what we perceive to be normal, and
Yeah.
it's not exactly always correct to like view the world in that lens. I think that
Yeah.
yeah, with autism, you know, they just are, and they're like perfectly, they could be just, they are just fine as they are, and it's just a different way of like they just have like a different way of communicating that we could be better at kind of perceiving.
Yeah, and that tends to be the perspective that like a lot of our work takes is coming from that idea.
Hmm. So yeah, that was definitely one of the things I thought was very interesting when I was reading uh, on this stuff. The whole perspective. Um, I think I think definitely like it would take uh, a long time to kind of like get that into like a lot of people's thinking, to kind of like shift their perspectives on their thoughts that on their thoughts on people that aren't like them, like aren't exactly what they view as normal.
Yeah, I agree that like yeah, it takes a long time to sort of shift like the mainstream or the majority perspective of anything. I think yeah, it applies uh, to the work that we're doing with autistic people, but definitely expands well beyond that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, I mean, we could connect that a little bit to the paper that you know that you wrote. It was about stigma, about
Mhm.
people, about autistic college students. If you wanted to expand a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, so this was research that I started doing when I was an undergrad. It was like my like senior thesis, and I was interested in looking at what factors were sort of involved in the stigmatization of autistic college students, um, because we know that autistic people are stigmatized. We know that autistic college students specifically are stigmatized, but there was less work specifically looking at like what specifically is playing into that stigmatization. Um, some people like some research had been like, oh, is it the label of, this person has like a label of they're autistic or have autism, or is it like how people, how autistic people act that is playing into it, or like specific parts of how people act, maybe like, eye contact isn't, maybe people don't really care about eye contact, but if like you fidget a ton, that's like, then people are kind of like, oh, I don't really want to hang out with you. Um, so I was interested, yeah, in kind of like what exactly when people are making the decision of like, I don't think I really want to hang out with you, what is sort of like playing into that.
Right. And I think that I agree. That's a very interesting question to kind of try to figure out. Like, what are the factors that contribute to that stigma?
Yeah. And my paper sort of looked at two things sort of in particular. One of them was social behavior, so like how people act, and the way that we did that was we had non-autistic college students read these sort of like short stories that we had written that were like first person perspectives of them going to like a club meeting and sitting down next to like another club member, and this other club member that they were going to like read about having an interaction with was either described sort of behaving in ways that were sort of associated with autistic people, or described as behaving in ways that were considered quote unquote normal. And so that was one part of it. And then additionally, I was also interested in um, what's sort of commonly called special interests, which is a lot of autistic people have something that they're very knowledgeable about and passionate about, and might have sort of like expert level knowledge of sort of a narrow topic. So for some people, it's Star Wars or vacuum cleaners or bugs or sort of like any topic you can think of. There's probably some autistic person who is like an expert at this specific topic. And so I was interested in like, does having and talking about a special interests make non-autistic people or contribute to like non-autistic people stigmatizing you more than not having one? And does like the topic of your special interests like impact that stigmatization? Like I was thinking like, something that's, more common. Like if you're really into like a popular video game, maybe that's not as like stigmatizing as if you're like really into um, like vacuum cleaners or something that was considered less like of a common interest.
Mm-hmm. So what did we find out, or what did you find out, Kayden? The results. The
Um,
results.
so part of it was like in a lot of research, like almost like part one of like looking at your results before you get into like maybe like the nitty gritty or the new questions is like almost like confirming like what should be like a basic like fact of it. So like if we did this study and found like, oh, the stigma, how we measured stigma shows that like people want to hang out with autistic and non-autistic characters just the same amount, like that would be weird, because we know from other studies that autistic people are stigmatized, that like generally non-autistic people don't want to hang out with them as much as they want to hang out with other non-autistic people.
Right.
So that was sort of like, validating the kind of measurement we used. And so we, found what we would expected and what indicated that the measures that we were using were like working, was that our participants, our non-autistic college students, stigmatized the autistic sort of like characters that we created more than the non-autistic characters than we created. They wanted to have greater social distance from them.
Okay.
So that was sort of like our first almost check mark finding.
So that
and then like getting and getting to the sort of like special interests part, was that we had seen that social behavior, that acting in a way that was more associated with autistic was more stigmatized. What I was thinking was that having a special interest and having sort of autistic social behavior would be like the most stigmatizing. Would be like the most stigmatizing. People would want to hang out with those people like the least. But like being autistic and not having a special interest maybe would be still stigmatized, but maybe less stigmatized. But what we found that was different than what we expected was that if the character was described as having, as acting in a way that was considered autistic, it didn't matter like if they had a special interest as well or if they didn't. Everybody was sort of stigmatized like a similar amount. So it wasn't like an additive effect where like if you had a special interest on top of behaving in ways associated with autism, that was like more stigmatizing. But when our participants sort of like rated the characters that were just described in behaving in non-autistic ways, their special interests like did make a difference. So sort of if you are, behaving or you're described as behaving in a way that's considered like quote unquote normal, then having a special interest is sort of like, or could be more stigmatizing in that context, because it's sort of like that's a marker of like, oh, this person's different in some way. It's something that sort of still falls outside of what's considered normal if you're talking a lot about a specific subject matter rather than just like engaging in like small talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was reading it, I thought that was really interesting. That kind of like that the way that it kind of like deviated from your original hypothesis, that having those autistic characteristics plus having a special interest didn't end up being the most stigmatized group was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, so we sort of interpreted that as like if your behavior is markedly different than what would be sort of considered typical, then like there's not really that sort of like washes out the effect of like having a special, talking a lot about a specific subject, like having that unusual social behavior is like sort of like the peak or like the main marker when people are deciding if they want to like spend time or do activities with you. But if the way you act is sort of considered more typical, then adding on something, what might be considered like smaller, like talking a lot about a video game or talking a lot about like computer hardware, is something that could be like othering, and sort of have people sort of disinclined to hang out.
definitely. I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit about the whole process behind the kind of your experience in those 4 years of creating this paper. I know that just publishing a scientific paper is not easy at all. And so how is that journey to get to this final product?
Um, it was definitely a little bit frustrating. I don't think it's an uncommon reaction from what I'm hearing that like by the time you like actually get a paper published, you kind of never want to look at it again. Um, because this, like I said, this paper got published in I think November of 2020. It came out. This was the third time that I had tried to get it published. I'd sent it into two other journals in the years prior to this, and it had been rejected. Um, and every time that like I'd submit it and it get rejected, and I would spend like a couple of months editing it and revising it and trying to make it better for the next time. Um, and I don't know. Part of it was frustrating because, like I said, I was really just kind of tired of looking at it. I just wanted it like out. So that almost made like the editing like drag on longer. Um, like there were definitely like times where I didn't like even open the file for like months at a time just because I couldn't bring myself. I was like, I can't read this again. I can't like edit this one pair. I can't do it. Which like just made it take longer because I wasn't editing it, so it wasn't like progressing towards wherever I was gonna like try to get it published next.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I don't know, sort of like the balance of like I don't want to look at it, but if I don't look at it, it's not going to get out. It's not going to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was also kind of like figuring out because this was the first paper that I have published. So like just figuring out like the kind of writing that works for academic journals and like sort of like finding I guess like my like voice in it compared to like the other authors on the paper or like my advisors who would like give me feedback and edits and like decide well is that sentence actually like how I would say that, or is like this other person's voice like now sort of like overtaking my own?
Does that? How does that? That is an interesting idea. Voice. Like, is that because like the person reading it, like, why? Like, could you explain like why that is important? You think like getting your voice versus like someone else's voice, like where does that play in?
Um, for me, it was I guess kind of important in two ways. In one, it was important to me that like once I eventually got this published and I like went back to read it, that it would all like flow together because there are sometimes I'll read a sentence after I've done editing, especially with my current advisor, where I'll be reading and be like, okay, I wrote this, and then there'll be like a bit that he had edited it, and I had taken I had taken his advice. I thought, okay, that makes sense, and I read it, and I'd be like, oh, that's not how I would say that. It'd be like, it'd be my voice, and then it'd be like Vikram's voice for three sentences, and then back to mine. And I'm like, well, that just doesn't like flow in terms of reading. Um, but then also like confirming to myself like that like this is my work and that's definitely like what I intended to say and how I'm interpreting the data in context of the argument that I'm making, and making sure that like we didn't veer off in a different direction because somebody edited a sentence and that changed like I don't know the meaning of the paragraph and thus the argument or something. So I feel like part of it was just like me developing as a writer, um, and wanting to like make sure things were coherent and but like just felt like it was my work. Um, and then some parts of it was also I was very careful when I was writing this paper in how I was interpreting the data because I mean, a lot of research, the data is the data. It's a bunch of numbers, and you make meaning out of that based on the story that you construct around these numbers based on the prior research, and then how you interpret what this new information means in the context of that. And it would be easy to say that, oh, autistic people are stigmatized because of how they act, so we should teach them to act completely differently. Or, oh, people stigmatize you when you talk about really passionately about certain topics, so you shouldn't talk about them. And that I didn't want to contribute a paper that was like, look, non-autistic people don't like or don't want to hang out with people who do these things, so we should teach people not to do those things. So I wanted to make sure that, like, when I was taking edits, that I was keeping that in mind and not phrasing things in a way that could be, I guess, used, in other research to advocate for, like, focusing on changing autistic people versus, like, more focusing on providing tools and education for non-autistic people to, like, not be crappy to autistic people.
Definitely. I think you did. I'm sure that you did a lot of that nitpicking of every word that you put in there, trying to see like how somebody could somehow misconstrue, your words to fit their narrative that might be not so beneficial to autistic people. But,
it was definitely a concern. I think it'll be a concern in every paper I write, because you put something out and then, anybody can read it and sort of use it to support their argument. Like, in academic publishing, you have this big old list of references at the end of any paper that gets written, but nobody really goes through and checks, like, oh, when you referenced, Smith 2012, did you, like, reference it, like, correctly, I guess, or did you actually reference it in the way that Smith 2012 was intending you to, or did you just, like, kind of take it to support your argument, even though maybe it wasn't quite intended that way?
Yeah, I mean,
so I try to be, like, purposeful in saying, like, this could be interpreted this way, but the authors don't support that interpretation because blah 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 blah.
I remember reading that specific section in the discussion section where
Yes.
I was like, oh, that's pretty, like, like, it's right there, like, it's in your face. Like, where was it? Oh yeah, it's like, it says here, one route to reducing the stigma associated with autism would be to teach autistic people to behave in socially normative ways and to discourage their SIs. And then it just says, this is not the route we advocate. It was a very short sentence, and I read that, I was just like, oh, like, it's right here, like, their opinion.
And there are a few places where some of the other authors on this paper and I disagree about some things. Not necessarily that sentence, but, like, in any fields, people have different opinions about various things. So we disagree on a few points in things. And yeah, that was definitely a sentence when I was writing where I was like, I might get some pushback for this, but no, nobody was upset about anything. But it was that was a sentence I was ready to, like, go to bat for.
Yeah, I was, as I was reading the whole thing, I was just like, wow, like, I was just in awe, by the way, because, in undergrad we had to read papers, scientific papers, and when I looked at this, like, to have, like, a friend that, like, built this, like, an actual paper and, like, published it, and, like, I'm reading it and it sounds, like, so legit, like, and it's just so impressive to me. And when I get to that point, I'm like, when I get to that point of the discussion, I just hear, I hear your voice there. So you did a nice job with the voice thing there.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yes, that was you know, again, like I said, really impressive. Do you have plans for another paper at the moment?
Yeah, so one that I'm working on is not an experimental paper. Like we didn't like, recruit participants and like do a study. It's like a review of existing literature, so other people have published papers, and uh, so we're sort of like summarizing what has been done like in the field, sort of like a lay of the land. And that's with another couple of grad students. Um, and that's focusing on this technique called hyperscanning. And so this is sort of related to the idea of, instead of like studying like one person, studying like multiple people. So like two people who are interacting, wearing EEG headsets to like measure brain waves. And hyperscanning is sort of like a general term for like uh, this studying of like live live interaction, and like looking at like how people's brains react like during interactions. So sort of like a summary of the literature of like what's been done in terms of like hyperscanning EEG studies. So that's one that's, I'm hoping, is gonna like, we're gonna like send it to a journal, and initially probably get rejected because that's just how life goes. But like step one of process.
Right.
And then another one that is like much earlier, like I haven't even, like there's not even a Word document like called like open for it yet.
Right.
Is we did a follow-up study on the paper that we just talked about. We did like we wrote, like, we changed the stories we had people read, and we used a few different measures, and we recruited new participants to sort of like replicate what we had found, to be like, no, what we found the first time wasn't just like a unique phenomenon, like it's sort of consistent. And then also just like get a little bit more information about how special interests are perceived, and how that might be to like people already knew about autism, and like how much they'd interacted with autistic people like in the past. So that is like on the horizon for the next paper I want to do. I submitted some like very preliminary results for that to like a conference, to like sort of present like a post, which is sort of like a very like very short like intro. Here's what we did. Here's what we found. Here's what we think it might mean, to sort of get feedback. And so hoping that I'll maybe start writing up that paper at some point soon, maybe.
Well, very nice. I'm sure that's. Well, definitely, I'd love to take a look at that in the future to kind of see the follow up to this paper that I read. And excited to see what you guys find for that future project of yours.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, one question I did like have was, we did talk about a little bit of the future in terms of like what happens like after grad school, and you trying to, I guess, find a job wherever that kind of finds you. What do you think of the longer term? Like, what do you see yourself maybe in like 10, 15 years? Like, where would you, like, what kind of, I guess, where do you see yourself?
Like I said, I'd like to stay working like in the academic sort of like career path. I'd like to, which sort of looks like being like a professor at a university who teaches classes, and like has a research lab where I could sort of ask more of these questions about how autistic people interact with each other and how autistic people are perceived. I sort of like to integrate the sort of like papers that I talked about, where we sort of, I'm interested in like using maybe like this, hyperscanning EEG to look at how autistic people interact and sort of look at that on like a both a behavioral level, so like what you can see just by watching an interaction, but then also and looking at how that like looks sort of like under the hood, so to speak. And so, like having my own lab would give me sort of like the opportunities to like focus my research or sort of like combine lines of research that haven't previously been combined. So that's sort of where I'm hoping to see myself. I also spend some of my time doing like diversity, equity, inclusion work, like specifically looking at like making like higher education more accessible to like disabled students and faculty members. So like that's something else that I'd like to like continue doing in grad school, but then also like in whatever sort of like job that I end up in.
Nice. So, Dr. Kayden is on the way. PhD?
Yeah, that's to be completed theoretically in like 2025.
Wow, okay. That is exciting stuff. Everything that you kind of mentioned, like what you see for yourself. I mean, you've had a pretty good record of this like straight pathway you've built for yourself, and it seems like you've been enjoying it, and it's something
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems like you're just really passionate about it and doing good work because of it.
Yeah. It's like I said, I don't really know what else I would be doing if I wasn't doing the psychology and the research like work that I'm doing. So it's definitely something I enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing you in Stockwell. Dr. Stockwell as the professor and head of his research lab. I would have had this great opportunity to interview him in 2021, 4 years before he becomes a doctor.
Maybe you can do a revisit in 25. Maybe I'll come back to the Gabriel podcast.
I would love that. Is one of the things that this is one of the long-term goals of mine is to bring these guests back and to look back on these previous episodes and just see their growth. And I mean, I would have loved to be able to do one of these like 4 years ago, like when you're like starting out in undergrad, and to see you like now and where you are at. Like you've had a lot of I mean, you've come a long way and you've done a lot, and you've helped. I'm sure that you've helped a lot of people already, and there's a lot more to come of that.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right, Kayden. Well, I pretty much covered everything that I kind of wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Well, there is Kayden Stockwell, my friend from high school. He's definitely developed into quite the person that has done a lot of research, done the scientific processes, done papers, and doing good work out there in the academic world. So, if I ever have questions, I would definitely love to ask him for advice on graduate school and whatever possible things there might be. Where can the viewers find you, Kayden?
Probably the best way to find me is on Twitter. My handle is @Kayden Stockwell. That's KaydenStockwell.
There you go. Yeah, go to that Twitter. Definitely check out all of his stuff. Do you post regularly over there, or do you share?
I post pretty regularly. I'm in the process of building a website where you can like find all of the like academic and outreach stuff that I've done. It's not quite ready for prime time yet, but there'll be a link to it in my like Twitter profile description when it's up.
Okay, we'll definitely try to update the description of this video whenever that comes up, and as well as all the other links to his paper, to the newsletter. I'll definitely link that in the description of the video, and as well as his Twitter and his future website when it comes out. All right, Kayden. Well, it was great talking to you. It's been a very long time since our last conversation, but I'm glad that I was able to reconnect with you a little bit here.
Yeah, it was good to catch up and talk to you. Thank you again for inviting me.
No problem, and you definitely have to come back. Definitely like 2025, but hopefully, if you have time, maybe sooner, just to have a little,
Yep, yep.
that middle process to check up on where Kayden Stockwell is in the world. So definitely. So that'll wrap up this second episode of the Gabriel podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed our little conversation here about this the life and story of Kayden Stockwell. So thank you, and have a nice rest of your day.